The high school hallways were always a kind of organized chaos, a river of noise and rushing bodies that flowed between classrooms. For most students, it was a place to see friends, to shout jokes across the crowd, to feel the pulse of the day. For the girl named Maya, it was something else entirely. It was a place to practice being invisible. She had perfected the art of it. She walked with a slight slump, not out of sadness, but as a way to make herself smaller. Her worn-out gray hoodie was a kind of uniform, chosen specifically for its ability to not be noticed. Her backpack was always clutched a little tighter to her shoulders, a shield against the accidental bumps and the careless elbows that never seemed to notice her anyway. She moved through the crowds like a whisper, her presence so faint that people would often look right through her, their conversations flowing around her as if she were a stone in the stream. She didn't mind. Invisibility was quiet, and quiet was safe. Her classes were much the same. She was a ghost in the back row, a quiet observer who did her work and kept her thoughts to herself. Teachers would sometimes forget she was there, their eyes sweeping over her head as they scanned the room for volunteers. She rarely raised her hand, not because she didn't know the answers, but because the act of drawing all that attention to herself felt like stepping into a spotlight she wasn't ready for. Her voice, when she was forced to use it, was soft and often trailed off, as if it were embarrassed to make a sound. She had friends, in a way. A few other quiet girls she would eat lunch with, their conversations more about comfortable silence than deep secrets. But no one really knew her. They didn't know about the world that lived inside her head. The one class that was different was music. It was both a refuge and a kind of torture. It was a refuge because it was the language her soul spoke. It was torture because it was the one place where she desperately wanted to be heard, but couldn't find her voice. The music room itself was a beautiful space, with tall windows that let in the afternoon sun, making dust motes dance in the light like tiny sparkling notes. The air always smelled of old wood, rosin from the string instruments, and the faint, metallic scent of valve oil from the trumpets. At the front of it all was Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison was a man who seemed to be permanently tired of high school students, which was ironic since he had chosen to spend his life teaching them. He was a brilliant musician, everyone knew that. He could sit at the grand piano and make it weep or sing with a skill that was professional, breathtaking. But when he turned to face his class, the music seemed to die inside him. He had a sharp, cynical wit and a very low tolerance for anything he considered mediocre. He was looking for stars, for prodigies, for students who walked in with a fire in their belly and a confidence that couldn't be shaken. He valued boldness above all else. A shy student who played with perfect technique but no showmanship would get a bored sigh and a try to actually feel it this time. Confident student who played with passion, but a few wrong notes would get a nod of approval. Mistakes I can fix, he'd often say. A lack of guts I can't. To him, Maya was less than a ghost. Ghosts at least have a story. She was just empty space, a blank spot on his seating chart. He knew her name, of course, but it had no face, no personality attached to it. When he took attendance, his eyes would glaze over for a moment as he said her name, and he would barely register the soft "here" that came from the back corner. He never called on her. Why would he? She never volunteered, and her entire posture screamed, "Don't look at me." In his world of bold performers and future stars, she was a non-entity, a piece of furniture he had to navigate around Dotso every day. Maya would take her seat in the very last row, tucked into a corner by the window. She would place her worn notebook on the desk and open it to a fresh page. While Mr. Harrison lectured on music theory or critiqued a student's clumsy attempt at a sonata, Maya would disappear. Her head would bend over the page, her pencil moving with a quiet, determined purpose. Her classmates, if they ever bothered to look, would just think she was doodling or writing notes. They saw a girl scribbling in a notebook. They didn't see what was really happening. Inside that notebook was her world. It was filled with neat, precise staves drawn with a ruler so the lines were perfectly straight. And on those lines were notes, cascading down the page in complex, beautiful melodies. She wasn't just doodling. She was composing. The music in her head was a constant companion, a soundtrack to her life. When she felt the pang of loneliness in the crowded hallway, a melancholic minor key would play in her mind. When she saw the sun hit the dust motes in the music room, a light, arpeggiated melody would sparkle. Her notebook was where she let that music out, where she gave it form and shape. She could hear it all so clearly in her head, the soaring strings, the delicate piano notes, the deep, resonant bass. It was a symphony that no one else could hear, a secret conversation between her and the paper. This was her real voice, strong and clear and full of all the emotions she could never say out loud. It was the one place where she wasn't invisible. In the world of her music, she was the conductor, the composer, the star. But as the bell would ring, its sharp, jarring sound shattering her private concert, she would close the notebook with a quiet thud. The music would be silenced, trapped once again. And she would pack her bag, pull up the hood of her sweatshirt, and melt back into the river of students, just another whisper in the crowd, her incredible talent a secret locked away in the back of the room. The week of the big school assembly arrived, bringing with it a strange energy that crackled through the hallways. It was a mix of excitement and dread. For the teachers, it meant extra work and corralling hundreds of overstimulated teenagers. For the students, it meant missing a few classes and a chance to perform or watch their friends perform. In the music room, the tension was particularly thick. The centerpiece of the music department's performance was a notoriously difficult piano solo, a piece that was meant to be the grand finale, the moment that made everyone sit up and take notice. The student chosen for this solo was the school's star pianist, a tall, confident boy who carried himself with an air of easy superiority. He had been practicing for months, and Mr. Harrison had been grooming him, pushing him, shaping his performance into something truly spectacular. The teacher was proud in his own cynical way, and was already imagining the impressed faces of the other teachers and the principal. Then, 10 minutes into the class, the door flew open. A freshman from the office, red-faced and out of breath, stumbled in, clutching a pink slip of paper. "Mr. Harrison?" he gasped. "Message from the nurse." Mr. Harrison snatched the note, his brow furrowed in annoyance. As his eyes scanned the short, typed message, his face went from annoyed to thunderous. He crumpled the paper in his fist and let out a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire body. The news spread through the room like a silent wave. The star pianist had the flu. A bad case of it. He wouldn't be back for the rest of the week. Panic began to set in. The grand finale was gone. The showstopper was now a gaping hole in the program. Mr. Harrison started pacing at the front of the room, his hands jammed deep into his pockets. "All right," he said, his voice tight. "Options now." He looked out at his students, his eyes sharp and demanding. This was no longer a class. It was an emergency room, and he was the surgeon looking for a compatible organ donor. His gaze swept over the flute section. "No offense," he said, "but a flute can't fill that space." He looked at the drummers. "And we're not turning a classical piece into a rock concert." His eyes landed on the other two students who played piano. One of them, a girl with bright pink hair, immediately shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "I couldn't," she whispered. "Not that piece? It's way too hard." The other boy, who was quite good but lacked confidence, just stared down at his shoes, pretending to be invisible. Mr. Harrison's frustration grew with every passing second. He could feel his reputation, his one chance to shine this semester, slipping away. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements sharp and agitated. The room was dead silent, everyone holding their breath, hoping the lightning of his attention wouldn't strike them. He scanned the room one last, desperate time. His eyes passed over the back row, over the empty chairs and the slouching figures, and then they stopped. They landed on Maya. She was exactly where she always was, tucked into her corner, her head bent over her notebook. To him, she was just a shape, a dark smudge against the bright window. An idea, born of pure, unadulterated sarcasm, sparked in his mind. It was a terrible idea, but it was also a way to release some of the tension, to get a laugh and remind everyone who was in charge. A slow, almost predatory smile spread across his face. "All right," he said, his voice suddenly light and conversational, a tone that everyone in the class knew meant trouble, since no one else seems to have the guts for it. He started walking slowly towards the back of the room, his eyes locked on Maya's bent head. The students followed his gaze, and a low murmur of understanding went through them. They knew what was coming. How about we go for the ultimate surprise performance? A real dark horse. He stopped right in front of her desk. She didn't look up. He could see the top of her head, her hair pulled back in a simple, messy bun. He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "Maya," he said, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "How about it? Feel like saving the day? You can play, can't you? Everyone has to take piano lessons." The snickers started, first as a few quiet giggles, then growing into a ripple of open laughter that filled the room. It wasn't malicious, not really. It was the laughter of relief, the laughter of a group of kids who were glad they weren't the ones being singled out. They were laughing at the absurdity of it. Shy, quiet Maya, who never spoke, who never did anything to draw attention to herself, being asked to play the hardest piece in the entire program. It was the funniest thing they had heard all week. Maya didn't move. For a long moment, she just stayed there, her pencil still poised over her notebook. The laughter washed over her, but she didn't seem to shrink or blush. She just remained perfectly still. Mr. Harrison was enjoying this. He straightened up, ready to deliver the final punchline and move on. "See? No takers? I guess we'll just have to—" He was interrupted by a single, quiet word. "Okay." The laughter died instantly. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The word was so soft that at first people weren't sure they had heard it. Maya slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, which were usually focused on her desk, met Mr. Harrison's. They weren't scared or defiant. They were just calm. The teacher was completely thrown off balance. His sarcastic smile froze on his face, then slowly melted away. He had expected her to stammer, to refuse, to sink into her chair in embarrassment. He had not expected this. "Okay?" he repeated, his voice losing its mocking edge and sounding genuinely confused. "Yes," Maya said, her voice a little clearer this time. "I can do it." The room was so silent you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Every student was staring, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. The joke had backfired. The punchline had walked off the stage and refused to play its part. Mr. Harrison stared at her, trying to read her face, trying to figure out if this was some new kind of shyness, a weird way of saying no. But he saw nothing but calm certainty. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Right, well, okay then," he said, his voice a little awkward now. "Rehearsal. After school. In the auditorium. On the stage. Be there." He turned away quickly and walked back to the front of the room, not looking at her again. He was already convinced she would either not show up, or she would get to the piano, freeze up, and prove him right all along. The bell rang, its shrill sound shattering the strange silence. The students jumped up, grabbing their bags and chattering nervously as they filed out of the room. But as they passed Maya's desk, their chatter quieted. They looked at her differently now. Not with pity or dismissal, but with a strange, new curiosity. Maya packed her bag slowly, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if nothing had happened. She slung her worn backpack over her shoulder and walked out into the now empty hallway. And for the first time, as she walked through the quiet school, she didn't feel invisible. She could feel the weight of their stares still on her back, and underneath the familiar layer of fear, a tiny, flickering spark of something else began to glow. It felt a little bit like power. The walk home that day was different. The usual path, a familiar blur of cracked sidewalks and peeling paint on neighbors' fences, seemed sharper, more in focus. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows that stretched across the road like dark fingers. Maya usually walked with her head down, watching her worn sneakers scuff along the pavement. But today her head was up. She felt a strange, light feeling in her chest, a mix of fear and something else, something fizzy and exciting like a soda pop that had been shaken up. The words from the classroom kept echoing in her mind. Okay, I can do it. She had said them. She, the girl who practiced being invisible, had voluntarily stepped into the brightest spotlight in school. What was she thinking? As she walked, the world around her seemed to quiet down, replaced by the music that was always playing in her head. But today, it wasn't her own secret compositions. It was the piece Mr. Harrison had assigned. She could hear it already, the daunting, thunderous chords, the lightning-fast runs of notes that danced up and down the scale. It was a monster of a song, all sharp edges and dramatic mood swings. She had heard the star pianist play it before, and it had sounded impressive, but a little hollow, like a machine perfectly executing a task. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the music had more to say. It had a soul, and she just had to find it. She reached her apartment building, a small brick box with a rusted fire escape snaking up the side. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the quiet stairwell. Her home was a small two-room space she shared with her mother, who worked long hours as a nurse and was often not home when Maya got back from school. The apartment was always neat and clean, but it had a tired, temporary feel to it. The furniture was old and mismatched, the curtains were thin, and the floors creaked with every step. It was not a place of grandeur, but it was her quiet space. She dropped her backpack by the door and walked into the living room. There, in the corner by the window, was her piano. It wasn't a gleaming, polished grand piano like the one on the school stage. It wasn't even a nice upright. It was an old electric keyboard, its once white plastic now yellowed with age. Several of the keys were chipped and worn smooth from years of use, and one of them, a C sharp near the middle, stuck sometimes if you pressed it too hard. It was a hand-me-down from a cousin who had given up on lessons years ago. To anyone else, it would have looked like a piece of junk. To Maya, it was everything. She sat down on the simple wooden bench, the worn vinyl cool against her legs. She pulled the sheet music for the piece out of her bag. The pages were crisp, new. Mr. Harrison had given them to her with a skeptical look. She spread them out on the little stand attached to the keyboard. The notes were a dense forest of black ink on the white page, intimidating and complex. For a moment, a wave of doubt washed over her. Who was she kidding? She couldn't do this. She was just a girl who doodled in a notebook. This was real. This was for an audience. She took a deep breath, the way she always did before she let the music take over. She closed her eyes for a second, pushing away the voice of doubt, pushing away the memory of her classmates' laughter. She thought only of the music. She placed her fingers on the keys, her hands looking small and pale against the yellowed plastic, and then she began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, her fingers feeling a little clumsy and cold. But as she moved through the slow, moody introduction, something started to change. It was like watching a flower unfold in time-lapse. Her back straightened. Her shoulders, which were usually hunched forward, relaxed and then squared. Her head lifted, her chin tilting up slightly. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the sheet music, began to close. She wasn't reading the notes anymore. She was feeling them. The quiet girl in the corner of the classroom was gone, and in her place was a musician. The music began to grow. A quiet melody started in the right hand, a simple, sad little tune. But underneath it, her left hand began to add a foundation, a series of rich, resonant chords that filled the small room. The old keyboard, despite its flaws, had a surprisingly good sound, and she knew how to coax the best out of it. She played the sad melody with a touch so gentle it was like a whisper, and the chords with a weight that made them feel like a deep, steady heartbeat. Then the piece began to build. The tempo quickened. The melody became more complicated, twisting and turning like a winding path. Her fingers, which had seemed so unsure just moments before, now moved with a confidence and speed that was breathtaking. They flew across the keys, a blur of motion, hitting every note with a precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. This was her secret. This was what she did when no one was watching. This was where all her unspoken words, all her hidden feelings, all her joy and her loneliness went. They poured out of her fingertips and into the music. She reached the first major climax of the piece. The music exploded. Her hands came down on the keys in a series of powerful, crashing chords that seemed to shake the very walls of the small apartment. Her body swayed with the rhythm, her head bending forward in concentration. A lock of hair escaped her bun and fell across her face, but she didn't notice. She was completely lost in the storm of sound. It wasn't just noise. It was a story. It was a story of struggle, of anger, of a desperate cry for help. She played with a fierce intensity, her entire being focused on conveying the raw emotion of the music, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The crashing chords faded away, leaving behind a single, haunting melody that hung in the air like a ghost. The transition was so smooth, so natural, it was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a thunderstorm. Her touch became delicate again, almost caressing the keys. The melody was hopeful now, full of a gentle light. It was the feeling of relief, of peace after a long struggle. She played for over an hour, losing all track of time. She didn't just play the notes on the page. She inhabited them. She found the hidden corners of the music, the little nuances that the star pianist had missed. She added her own subtle phrasing, her own unique dynamics, making the piece entirely her own. When she finally played the last, fading chord and let her hands fall to her sides, she was breathing heavily. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead. The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was a silence that was full, a silence that was still vibrating with the energy of the music she had just created. She opened her eyes and looked around the small, dimly lit room. For a moment she felt a pang of the old loneliness, but it was quickly replaced by something new, a quiet, steady confidence. She looked down at her hands, at the fingers that could create such beauty and power. She could do this. She really could. The challenge from Mr. Harrison, which had started as a cruel joke, had become a gift. It had forced her to take the music she loved so much and let it out of its private cage. And now that it was out, she knew it could never go back in. The day of the school assembly felt like any other day, only more so. The hallways were thicker with noise, the air heavier with the scent of floor wax and teenage excitement. For Maya, it was like walking through a nightmare in slow motion. Every sound seemed amplified, every laugh felt like it was directed at her. The knot of fear that had been living in her stomach since she'd accepted Mr. Harrison's challenge had tightened into a cold, hard stone. She kept her head down, her hood pulled up, moving through the crowds like a shadow, but she felt like a spotlight was following her. Pinning her in place, backstage in the auditorium, was even worse. It was a chaotic maze of tangled cables, buzzing speakers, and nervous students. The drama club was fussing with costumes. The choir was warming up with a series of scales that clashed horribly with the rock band tuning their guitars in the corner. Maya found a small, dark corner behind a heavy velvet curtain and just stood there, trying to make herself small. She clutched the sheet music, the pages now soft and wrinkled from her constant handling. In her mind, she went over the piece again and again, her fingers twitching as if playing on an invisible keyboard. She had practiced until her fingers were sore, until the music was a part of her. But playing alone in her quiet apartment was a world away from playing for 1,000 people. Mr. Harrison found her there about 10 minutes before she was supposed to go on. He looked stressed, his tie loosened and his hair more disheveled than usual. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. His eyes weren't cynical or mocking anymore. They were just tired. And maybe a little bit curious. "You remember the starting cue?" he asked, his voice flat. Maya just nodded. She couldn't trust her voice to speak. "All right," he said, sighing. "Just, try not to freeze up. It's better to play and make a few mistakes than to not play at all." It was the closest he could come to encouragement, but it still felt like a vote of no confidence. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the roaring of her own thoughts. Soon, the lights in the auditorium dimmed, and the chaotic energy of the crowd softened to a low, expectant hum. The principal made a few boring announcements, followed by a clumsy skit from the drama club that got a few polite laughs. Then it was time for the music performances. Mr. Harrison walked out onto the stage to introduce her. The spotlight followed him, a bright, harsh circle in the middle of the vast darkness. "And now," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "We have a special performance. A piece that requires a great deal of skill and courage. We've had a last-minute change in performer, so please welcome Maya." He said her name without any fanfare, his tone almost dismissive, as if he were already apologizing for what was about to happen. A few scattered claps came from the audience, but most people were just shifting in their seats, whispering to their friends. From the wings, Maya took a deep breath. This was it. She walked out onto the stage. The journey from the darkness of the wings to the center of the spotlight felt like the longest walk of her life. The grand piano on the stage looked enormous, a polished black beast that seemed to glow under the lights. The auditorium was a huge, dark cave filled with 1,000 indistinct faces, all of them turned towards her. She felt a wave of dizziness, a powerful urge to just turn around and run back to the safety of the curtains, but she didn't. She reached the piano bench and sat down. It was smooth and cold. She adjusted the bench, a small, familiar ritual that helped to center her. She placed her wrinkled sheet music on the stand, though she knew she wouldn't really need it. She looked out at the crowd one last time, seeing the bored expressions, the glowing screens of a few kids trying to secretly use their phones. They expected nothing. They were waiting for her to fail. She placed her fingers on the keys. They were cool to the touch. She closed her eyes, blocking out the lights, the faces, the expectations. She thought only of the music, of the story it had to tell. And then she began to play. The first note was not loud. It was clear and pure, a single, perfect sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. A hush began to fall over the auditorium, starting from the front rows and spreading like a ripple. Heads turned. Conversations died. Phones were slipped back into pockets. The first few bars of the piece were quiet and melancholic. Maya played them with a delicate touch, her fingers dancing lightly on the keys. The melody was simple but full of a deep, piercing sadness. It wasn't just a sad tune. It was the sound of loneliness itself, a cry in the dark that everyone in the room understood in their own way. The students who had been whispering were now silent, their expressions softening as they listened. Then the music began to change. A new energy entered the piece, a sense of conflict and struggle. Maya's fingers started to move faster, the melody becoming more complex, more urgent. Her body began to sway with the rhythm, her head bending forward in concentration. She was no longer just a girl sitting at a piano. She was a vessel for the music. Her entire being was focused on the keys, on the sound, on the emotion. The quiet girl in the back of the classroom had vanished, replaced by someone powerful and commanding. The music swelled, growing louder and more intense. The melody and the bass line began to intertwine in a fierce argument, a storm of sound that filled the entire auditorium. She played the difficult runs of notes not with precision, but with a fiery passion. It wasn't perfect. There was a raw, wild edge to it that made it even more compelling. This was not a machine executing a program. This was a heart pouring itself out. The audience was completely captivated. No one was shifting in their seats. No one was bored. They were leaning forward, their faces rapt. Completely caught up in the story the music was telling. In the wings, Mr. Harrison stood frozen. He had been watching with his arms crossed, ready to wince at the first mistake. But now his arms had fallen to his sides. His mouth was slightly open. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was not the hesitant, nervous student from his classroom. This was a musician of incredible depth and power. He had heard the star pianist play this same piece a dozen times, and it had always sounded like a technical exercise. But this was alive. It was breathing and bleeding and feeling. A wave of something like awe, mixed with a sharp, painful pang of regret, washed over him. He saw the joke he had made not as a sarcastic comment, but as a cruel, ignorant act. He had been standing next to a masterpiece and had only seen a blank wall. The music reached its final, thundering climax. Maya's hands came down on the keys in a series of powerful, crashing chords that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was a roar of defiance, a declaration of strength. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. She played the final, fading chord, a single resonant note that hung in the air like a question. And then there was silence. That it wasn't just quiet. It was a profound, stunned silence. The entire auditorium, 1,000 students and teachers, held their breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The air seemed to vibrate with the ghost of the music that had just filled it. Maya sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her eyes still closed. She slowly opened them and looked out at the silent, dark room, a little dazed as if waking from a dream, and then a single person in the front row started to clap. It was quickly followed by another and another. Then the dam broke. The auditorium erupted. The applause was not just loud. It was a physical force, a deafening wave of sound that washed over the stage. It grew and grew until it became a school-wide standing ovation. Students were on their feet, cheering and whistling, their faces filled with shock and admiration. Maya looked out at the roaring crowd, a shy, genuine smile finally spreading across her face. She saw her friends from lunch, staring at her with their mouths wide open. She saw teachers she didn't even know, all of them on their feet, clapping for her. And in the wings she saw Mr. Harrison. He wasn't clapping. He was just standing there, staring at her, his face a mask of utter disbelief and humbled awe. The joke was over. The shock had just begun. The sound that hit her was a physical thing. It wasn't just noise. It was a wall of pure energy, 1,000 hands clapping in unison, a wave of appreciation so strong it almost knocked her backward. For a moment, Maya just sat there, her fingers still resting on the keys, her mind struggling to catch up. The world had been silent, and now it was roaring. The bright lights of the stage, which had felt so threatening just minutes before, now felt warm, like a blanket. She looked out at the sea of faces, but they weren't a blur anymore. She could see individuals. She saw the boy from her math class who always slept, now wide awake and on his feet, clapping enthusiastically. She saw the librarian, a stern woman who rarely smiled, with a look of pure wonder on her face. They were all standing, all of them. For her, a shy, uncertain smile touched her lips. It wasn't a performance smile. It was a real one, a bubble of pure, unadulterated joy rising up from a place so deep inside her she didn't even know it existed. This was what it felt like to be seen. Not just looked at, but truly seen. The feeling was so overwhelming, so powerful, that it brought a sting of tears to her eyes. She quickly blinked them back. She didn't know what to do. Performers knew how to take a bow, how to milk the applause, how to say thank you. She was just Maya, so she did the only thing that felt natural. She gave a small, clumsy nod to the audience, a gesture of quiet gratitude. Then, feeling suddenly exposed and desperate for the familiar comfort of shadows, she stood up and quickly walked off the stage. Disappearing into the darkness of the wings, the roar of the crowd followed her. But it was muffled back here, a distant, comforting thunder. The chaos of backstage had stopped. Everyone was staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. The drama kids in their silly costumes, the choir members in their robes, they all just stood there, their mouths slightly agape. And then she saw him. Mr. Harrison was standing by a thick cable coiled on the floor, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't clapping. He was just looking at her, his expression impossible to read in the dim light. She expected him to say something sarcastic, something to put her back in her place. Well, you got lucky, or don't let it go to your head. But he didn't. He just stood there for a long moment, the silence between them stretching out, filled only by the sound of the applause from the stage slowly dying down. Finally, he pushed himself away from the wall and walked towards her. He moved slowly, almost hesitantly, like a man approaching a wild animal he didn't want to startle. He stopped a few feet in front of her. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead looking at a spot just over her shoulder. "Maya," he said. His voice was quiet, rough, and completely stripped of its usual cynical edge. That was not what I was expecting." He cleared his throat, a low, awkward sound. I've heard that piece played 100 times. By professionals, by students. I've never heard it played like that. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen before. It wasn't just respect. It was a kind of humbled understanding. You didn't just play the notes, he continued, his voice even softer now. You told the story. The real story. I didn't even know it had one. Maya didn't know what to say. All the fear and anger she had felt towards him melted away, replaced by a strange, quiet pity. She saw him not as a cruel teacher, but as a man who loved music but had forgotten how to listen to it. "Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could manage. He nodded, a short, sharp movement. "Yeah," he said. "Well, you should get your things." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness before she could say anything else. But his words stayed with her, a quiet, clumsy apology that meant more than any grand speech could have. The final bell at the end of the day was her signal to escape. She usually rushed out, eager to get to the quiet of the street. But today, she took her time, packing her bags slowly as the classroom emptied around her. When she finally walked into the hallway, it was like walking into a different world. The river of students was still there, but the current had changed. As she moved through the crowd, it seemed apart for her. People stopped talking as she passed. They didn't point or stare rudely. They just watched, their eyes wide with a new kind of curiosity. She heard the whispers, not the mean-spirited gossip she was used to, but soft, amazed murmurs. "That's her? I sat next to her in history last year. I had no idea. It was incredible." A girl she barely recognized, a popular junior with a perfect ponytail, caught her eye. The girl didn't say anything, she just smiled, a real, warm smile of genuine respect, and gave Maya a small nod. It was a tiny gesture, but to Maya it felt like a handshake from the whole world. She was no longer a stone in the stream, an obstacle to be flowed around. She had become the source of the current, the reason the water was changing its course. The next day in music class was the true test. The room felt different. The air was clearer, the sunlight through the windows seemed brighter. Maya walked in, and for a second she automatically headed for her usual seat in the back corner. But she stopped. She hesitated for a moment, then walked to an empty seat in the third row, a place that was neither hidden nor in the spotlight. She sat down, and a few students nearby gave her small, encouraging smiles. When Mr. Harrison walked in, the class fell silent. He didn't look at Maya right away. He just went about his usual business, taking attendance, making a few announcements. But when he started the lesson on musical expression and phrasing, everything changed. "A lot of people can play the right notes," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But that's just the skeleton. The music is in the feel, in the space between the notes. It's about telling a story." As he said this, his eyes found hers and held them for a moment. It was a silent acknowledgement, a public apology. He was using her performance as a lesson, not to single her out, but to elevate the entire class. Later, when he asked for an example of a composer who used dynamics to create emotion, he looked directly at her. "Maya, any thoughts?" She answered, her voice still soft but clear, and for the first time, the whole class listened. That evening, Maya went home and sat down at her old yellowed keyboard. The apartment felt the same, but it didn't feel tired anymore. It felt like a workshop, a sacred space where something beautiful had been created. She opened her notebook, flipping past the dense, difficult score of the assembly piece. She turned to a fresh, clean page. For years, this notebook had been her secret, a private world where she could hide. Now it felt like something else. It felt like a foundation. She placed her pencil on the paper and began to draw the neat, precise staves. She started to compose a new melody. It wasn't sad or lonely. It wasn't angry or struggling. It was simple and clear, with a hopeful, rising melody and strong, steady chords. It was the sound of a girl who had found her voice. She began to play, the music filling the small room. She wasn't playing for a teacher, and she wasn't playing for a crowd. She was playing for herself. But for the first time she knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that if she ever wanted to, the whole world would want to listen. The invisibility was gone, and in its place was a silence filled with the promise of music.